the Department of Education, the Trump Department of Education, wrote in a letter to academic institutions that it may cut federal funding for those with policies related to race or diversity, signaling the latest crackdown by the Trump administration on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So they're going back to these Supreme Court rulings, et cetera, and they're basically saying any schools that that are doing anything DEI related, and that's a very broad and ambiguous term at times, will be punished. They will lose funding. So they're trying to instantly remove DEI from not just the political discourse, but also from the policy landscape. All of y'all are capable of talking about this. I only have my job because of DEI, so I'm going to absolve myself. Chris, let me start with you. What do you say?
I mean, I think the big thing about it is the point you made about the ambiguity of DEI, right? So there's no specificity. There's not like if you do X, Y, Z things. Like if you do anything that might possibly be identified as closely relating to what we consider to be DEI, you may possibly lose funding. It's also arbitrary. Like even the mechanism through which you lose funding, it's not spelled out. And I think, as with everything else with this administration, it begins with fear tactics, right? So I'm going to lay out the most obscene, the most egregious, the most, harmful thing possible. I'm going to say it publicly. I'm going to put a memo about it. I'm going to force you all to respond to it and be having really deep, ill conversations about it. I'm knowing I can't quite do it, but I will try to get halfway there. But I'm going to use your angst as a means through which I can get you distracted enough to push forth something that's more likely. So, for me, I read it all as weapons of mass distraction. I get what it's supposed to do. I always say, don't get too high or too low. What old boy says, pay attention to what's happening on the ground. And especially when it's that ambiguous, you can't really fine tune it on anything. So, stay low, keep firing, keep doing what you do, is what I tell the educators and school leaders all the time. And then, figure out ways to be able to navigate the, the landscape, because it's just all designed to get you losing your mind over everything. So you stop actually teaching, and that can't stop.
That's an important point here. Treva, let me bring you in on this because I'm reading some of the pieces of the response from Craig Trainer. Craig Trainer is the acting assistant secretary for civil rights within the education department, which, by the way, being the assistant secretary for civil rights under Donald Trump, I don't know if there's a more bizarre job to have. I don't even know what that means under Donald Trump. But he said the law is clear. This is how I assume he talks. The law is clear. Treating students differently on the basis of race to achieve nebulous goals such as diversity, racial balancing, social justice, or equity is illegal under controlling Supreme Court precedent. He said something else, though. He said, at its core, the test is simple. If an educational institution treats a person of one race differently than it treats another person because of that person's race, the educational institution violates the law. They also added one more piece that I think is interesting. They said schools also can't use students' personal essays, writing samples, extracurriculars, or other cues as a means of determining or predicting race. So if somebody, for example, says, I participated in the Black Student Union, you can't use that because they're saying that's just a backdoor way to get into their race. Or if their personal essay, they talked about being in Jack and Jill, or talked about, going to Third Baptist Church and being in the gospel choir. There are things that are just racial cues that just saying you can't rock with anymore. When you hear that, this idea that any invocation of race, any racial talk is itself illegal, but they would also probably argue in some sense reverse racism. What do you say to that? Let me get Dr. Lindsey in here.
I mean, it's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's all ridiculous. I certainly agree with Professor Emden here about distraction. And I'm in a state where our Senate just passed a bill that would completely overhaul this and do so much of what is being talked about. So my kind of energy is being spent on the ground in combating what is happening. Our Office of Inclusion, ours was called Inclusive Excellence. We kind of tried to preempt this and we still ended up having to close it. So that thing of moving in cowardice instead of moving with an intentionality around this is still costly no matter what. And so now we see that dissolving. We see the state legislature saying we want to get rid of this thing. And there is this idea, it's this really perverse reading of what a lot of these things were intended to do, how they were constructed. It's perverse readings of the 14th Amendment. It's perverse readings of what the actual Supreme Court ruling was. Even the person, the lawyer behind the case that helped bring down affirmative action in higher education is like, it actually didn't really apply to all of these other things, but this is interesting, right? Like there is a sense that what DEI stands for a lot of people are just saying non-white. It is very specifically Black, right? And I want to be very clear about that. There is a deep anti-Blackness that is functioning, that undergirds these kinds of statements. It is saying that we want an institution where whiteness is central. This is a coding that's using language that we've gotten accustomed to in the context of civil rights discourse to be able to do and enact a white supremacist agenda, right? And a white supremacist agenda protects white mediocrity. It even protects whiteness that ain't even mediocre, right? But it's meant to say, we don't want this space to have that, but we can use this language. We can manipulate and have folks who would vote for this man, who would support this agenda, actually get behind us and say, look, we're just saying race can't be a preference here. And we know that what they're saying is Blackness can't be centered here. Black can't be a part of these institutions. And other non-white groups, of course, are impacted by this. Other gender groups who are other than men are going to be impacted by this. But that reality is that they are thinking of a Black person when they're saying this. And I think it's really important to name that and be clear about that in the ways we're combating and resisting against what's happening on the ground.
That's an interesting idea. Slap. I mean, what? Yeah, jump on in.
So as an educator for 23 years in the K-12, particularly in urban schools, right? I think about that, in my time in education, about every 5 to 7 years, there's these keywords, right, that people kind of dive into and they grab onto, right? And I don't think that a lot of people even know really the full understanding impact of the words. What they end up doing is using them as keywords to sound smart. They use them as a keyword to get people's attention. And then, as education continuously, a discourse of it, it moves on, right? We start, much like a Black slang, right? We start to find a new word to define something. And so, as the brother was stating, like, these are weapons of mass distraction, right, inside of it, because it's so fluid inside of the way that he's speaking about it, that it can be used in the arms of a racist or a person who is covertly racist, right? And then, but for people who are for the cause, I think it can be covertly used, in the same way to empower, right? Because it all hasn't been stripped away, because it's so obtuse in its definition that maybe there's a way to redefine, and kind of label these particular pieces where there's opportunities to change. I mean, I live in Maryland, right? I have a Black governor, I'm proud to say, Wes Moore, and there's some aspects of a line that he's holding that, okay, yeah, I may not have to say these key words, but there's an element, that I'm standing on about the fairness and understanding that there's inequities inside of my state, and we're always going to address those. But I'm always curious, because I legitimately am an urban school teacher, right? And by saying that, if I now described exactly what that is, and are people going to get rid of that particularly now, like inside of the words that they utilize now to describe it, because that may even it too, right? Which is a school district now, right? As opposed to being, I work in Baltimore City, right? Where they're quick to label that as what it is, and it has a connotation that comes with it. So if we getting rid of DEI terms, how may that work and for the empowerment of some schools, because they will no longer be called urban in that sense. So sometimes I do think about it in the sense of like, yeah, they're defining us as Black, but then there's also sometimes where we can strip away that definition and start playing their game too.
Also, real quick, like
yeah.
when I said that, when I described it as a weapon of mass distraction, I didn't mean that there weren't some material consequences that came out of the distraction.
I didn't think it that way. I didn't think it that way.
You know what I mean? Like, I think there are material consequences in the ways that folks respond, and the kind of pedagogies getting enacted with young people. That's the science of teaching and learning. Educators always use pedagogy. So like, I think there are consequences, but I think that the overarching sort of like the move on the chessboard is a distraction, and then see what kind of material resources will come out of the sort of like really obtuse description of this thing to do. And then also, like we also got to be clear that like, yo, like it's implicit in any educational space that the young person or the adult is going to talk about themselves. It's impossible for you to tell me I can't talk about me, because it's just a natural piece of the art of teaching and learning. Anybody who doesn't understand that just doesn't understand education, or they understand education very well, and they recognize that if I ban me talking about me, it means then that I automatically get miseducated. Because in any scenario where you're teaching any young person and there's no space for the educator or the young person to talk about how they exist in the world, that means that there is a miseducation happening. And so, you know, it's complex and nuanced, but just don't fall for the okie doke where old boy got you wilding and then you stop teaching altogether, because then you're offering material consequences to something that's really obtuse, and just keep teaching. And then, you know, like Brother Slab said, make the adjustments pedagogically. And like now more than ever, man, this brother Jarvis Gibbons wrote this brilliant book called Fugitive Pedagogy. And if anybody's in education, I would say pick up that brother's book, because the argument he was making is like, yo, we teach our babies the way we teach our babies regardless. And if we held on to that, whether or not this is banned or that is banned, or this book or not that book, we still get done what needs to get done. And that's the way our people have always done it.
Before there was a term, we were learning. And I mean, it's just really that, you know what I mean, you know, to get to the basis of it.
And that's an important point. And I think about that every day as the discourse gets more and more far further away from a kind of justice minded discourse. You know, we've sort of accepted the reality that DEI no longer is a language we can use. And I don't care about DEI, the language itself, because I think that can be problematic as well. But the idea of saying that we're going to center race at times, or we're going to center other identities at times as a way of creating equity, the right has completely dismissed that as a possibility. What do we do? How do we deal with this? The reason I ask is because I saw the other day, by the way, this is Jarvis Gibbons' wonderful book. It's called Fugitive Pedagogy. Carter G. Woodson, The Art of Teaching. He's a brilliant historian of education. He's at Harvard University. Brilliant brother. Make sure y'all check out that book. But I know the NAACP issued a buying guide. I think that's the right word you would use, a buying guide. Basically, they said, look, some companies in corporate America have abandoned DEI. They have basically said, we're retreating. If you remember, after 2020, after George Floyd was murdered, there was a racial reckoning in the country. And let me tell you something, white people showed up for the racial reckoning. I own a bookstore, and I can tell you I sold more books in the month of May of 2020 than I had sold the previous year and a half, all put together. And 90% of the books I sold were Ibram Kendi and what's the white woman's name? Robin DiAngelo. Yeah. White people bought some race books. I don't know if they read them or not, but they bought them motherfuckers. I mean, they were buying them by the thousands. And there was a way
that was Congress after they had bent the knee, you know what I'm saying? You know, with the kids.
Exactly. Yeah, Nancy Pelosi wearing kente cloth and shit, looking like a Cuban green, you know what I'm saying, from WWF. Like, it was like all the things were happening. And it was a moment where America felt like, I didn't think they were changing, but I certainly felt like they were at least gesturing. And all the companies stood up and said, we stand for diversity. We stand for equity. We stand for inclusion. We have a plan. Target had a plan called I forget what it was called, but it was something, belonging at the bullseye was the name of their strategy, which as a Black person didn't make me feel that comfortable, because I don't ever want to be at a bullseye. But there was a way that they were talking about diversifying everything. And then everything changed. First of all, they promised a bunch of money, millions, if not billions of dollars. Sean Harper wrote a wonderful essay for Forbes a year ago or 2 years ago that pointed out that the money never showed up. Companies promised big money, but didn't donate the money. But they still were at least in line with the discourse. And then suddenly, the money not only just didn't show up, but they suddenly now, post-Trump 2024, they're saying, hey, we're not even down with that anymore. We don't even want to be associated with that anymore. And so the NAACP said, well, who are the companies that are pulling out? After President Trump's executive orders aimed at rooting out DEI policies, it got more and more vociferous. It's like almost like these companies never wanted to be down with DEI, but after Trump came in office, they got some bass in their voice. They got some courage. Their back straightened up. And so Google rescinded a goal it had set in 2020 to increase representation of underrepresented groups among the company leadership team by 30% over 5 years. Again, that's a reasonable goal. We don't have any Black people. We don't have any brown people. We don't have X, Y, and Z. We're going to increase this. And they literally retreated from that goal. That's not something you had to do. That wasn't even a monetary investment. It was just saying, we're going to diversify. They said, you know what? Turns out we decided not to. Target got rid of the belonging at the bullseye strategy. The Meta platform said it was getting rid of diversity, equity, inclusion programs, which featured policies for hiring, training, and picking vendors. Amazon said it was halting some of its DEI programs, although they didn't say which ones. They said they're going to wind down outdated programs and materials, and we're aiming to complete that by the end of 2024. McDonald's, remember Calvin? Some of y'all ain't old enough to remember Calvin, but you remember Calvin? And McDonald's whole agenda was, we're going to make some Black targeted marketing because Negroes buy hamburgers. And at some point, people said, well, look, it's not enough to target Black people to buy hamburgers and French fries and milkshakes. You have to actually target us in the boardroom. You have to target us in the executive side. You have to target us in the corporate side. And so McDonald's developed programming around that. And then 4 years later, because it was only 4 years ago they started doing this, they said, we're not going to do it. They also said that they're going to suspend their participation in a survey by the Human Rights Campaign. Now, this is important. The Human Rights Campaign, if you don't know, measures a very particular thing, right? Which is inclusion for LGBTQ plus employees. So this, to me, take race off the table for a minute. It's very simple. They're saying, look, we need to know, or we'd like to know, how many people in corporations are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, plus, etc. Right? How do we understand who fills your demographics? McDonald's said, we're not going to participate anymore. We're not going to tell you. Now, that doesn't mean that necessarily withdrawing from their hiring practices, but although it usually doesn't mean a good thing. But at the very least, they're saying we don't want to even be known as somebody who cares about this thing. Walmart, I'm just going to name a couple more, and then I'm going to get back to y'all. Walmart confirmed in November that it would not be renewing a 5-year commitment to an equity racial center that was set up in 2020. Coincidentally, right after George Floyd was killed. And they said they would stop participating in the Human Rights Commission's corporate equality index. So again, Walmart is saying that we're not going to participate in racial equity, and we're not going to make sure that items sold there. Walmart also said that it will better monitor its third-party marketplace to make sure items sold there do not include products aimed at LGBTQ plus minors, including chest binders intended for transgender youth. Let me say that a different way. They're not only saying that they're not dealing with race, and they're not only saying that we're not going to investigate how we're dealing with LGBTQ plus stuff, but we're going to actively make sure that we're not doing anything that could be construed as supportive of or in line with LGBTQ plus communities. We're not going to sell things that are aimed at LGBTQ plus minors, and even the language of minors suggests something very problematic, right? Because they invoke the language of minors, and this is what the right does all the time, to make LGBTQ plus identity seem like it's a moral transgression in and of itself. They're minors. What are we going to do with a gay minor? What are we going to do with a trans minor? As if they're not just human beings who exist in the world and who need products. Queer folk need products. Trans folk need products. But the idea is we're not going to do that. They certainly sell white targeted products, right? I mean, look, they certainly sell products that aren't targeted toward Black people, right? They certainly sell, but suddenly they sell products targeted toward straight people, but now we can't have products targeted toward lesbians or products targeted toward trans folk. This is absurd, but this is how they do. 4 years ago, that wouldn't have played. Anyway, I know I've been doing a lot of yapping. Ford, Harley Davidson, Brown Forman, I could go on down the list. John Deere, which doesn't really shock me. They all have basically said, F DEI, FLGBTQ plus communities. This is sort of how they are moving in the world. Dr. Lindsey, when you hear that, and I guess my question is, I like the NAACP's saying, look, these are the companies, put a spotlight on them. We can make our own choices about whether we want to rock with them or not. What else can we do to fight this moment where it seems like all the companies that thought it was cool to be down with us, whoever us is, are now saying it's the exact opposite and we run as fast as possible?
I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I mean, I do think there is a way of not showing up and not giving our dollars to places that don't value us across the board. We can look at in labor practices. I'm not shocked by a lot of these companies giving labor practices, given the quickness with which they've moved in this way. They're showing us who they are, who they've always been. There is something very disturbing and again, perverse about the fact that the murder of a Black man produced this performative allyship. And I would consider as well disaster capitalism, because a disaster happened. Ooh. And consequently, we are able to extract more dollars by telling you we care about this, we care about or want to amplify this. We come in, we have these these small efforts, which really most of the money that goes into this really is a money for products that then we are then consuming at these places. It's not actually money to equity organizations. It's not money funding Black Youth Project. It's not money funding Dream Defenders or Black Men Build or Asada's Daughters. That's not where the money is largely going. And we know that 4 years later, now almost 5 years later, that was not the case. Even in hiring more people who do this work, you're just trying to have Black, queer, Latinx, Asian faces, disabled faces, and people doing this work of saying, here are these products, right? And that's not to say that folks getting their products in these different stores or becoming high-ranking official executives at these aren't meaningful on some level. But let's be honest about the context in which that happens. And I think we have to be very clear about that in this kind of disaster capitalism spectrum and where we are in it right now. So they're also weighing what is the value of us continuing this performance and what way we capitalize upon that. And I think one way that we respond to that is, of course, by spending our dollars in other places if we're spending our dollars, but also still calling them out, still wanting to say, like, we know what you did and we know who you are. And even if you reverse course again, and some of them like, oh no, we're just renaming, we still plan on doing certain things, it's just not DEI. Believe them. Believe who they are in this moment. Believe the ways that they have refused to show up, and look at the very clear ways in which they've chosen to show up, right? They're cowards, and they were cowards, and they extracted from us for the last 4.5 years. And they absolutely also exploited the murder of George Floyd.
So let me ask you a question. How do you think about, how can I put this? Boycotting is hard. When you see all these companies, Walmart, Target, McDonald's, I mean, like it's a solid list. I mean, John Deere would probably okay with his Black people, but like when you get to Walmart, Target, McDonald's, just right there, like, do you feel compelled to resist? Do you feel compelled to boycott them? How do you respond to these kinds of things?
So it's a challenge, and I have an understanding that I think being in a level of sacrifice, right? You go through a level of researching and trying to find ways that you can plug into your community and spend your Black dollars with Black businesses. But we also have to understand is that food deserts are a real thing. Right. Walmart has absolutely cornered the market on a lot of products that they drive down the prices, in that particular way. So sometimes for people, that is a resource. I think the biggest error in all this, and the professor spoke on this, right, is us responding to the knee-jerk reaction of that people really, they didn't do as much for us as they just tried to appeal to us. I mean, I never knew that human nature was, we don't think of humanity being a trend, right? But it was, right? Soon as something happened to a Black guy, it was, okay, let's do these targeted pieces, right? The old saying goes is that when there's blood on the street, buy property. But when there's Black blood on the street, shoot a commercial, right? Just show that your appeal and that you feel sorry for them, right? That's the way that people appeal to us in that particular way. I've long since said that, look, I don't care about your Juneteenth paper plates and napkins. I don't care about, the same thing with, in Pride Month, right? Everything is rainbow. As soon as Pride is over, all that rainbow stuff is gone, right? So are you an ally, or are you just really doing it for 30 days because it's trendy? You know what I'm saying? Like, and that's always been the way that it's been. I think we look at those things and we go, oh my God, they finally opened the door for us. But the reality of this is they only opened the door to sell their products. And so when you come to the moral, compass of who should I support and who I shouldn't support, I think there's a lot of things that take into consideration. Yes, and people say boycott a lot. And I always think about, my aunt that, lives in a rural area, and the Walmart is the only way for her to get groceries. You know what I'm saying? And it's just like, well, how are we organized to challenge those particular pieces? Because we allow Walmart and Amazon and all these things to take over the mom and pop because we were looking for a better deal. And now we close those people out. So then now when you want to actually then put your stuff in the Black dollar, well, guess what? There's a lot of places that Black dollar is no longer available because all of us sold out for the cheaper good. You know what I'm saying? We all sold out for $4.99 box of cereal when it was, $5.50 at this place. So there's these challenges that I think that we have to talk about that comes right under, we should boycott all these places. We have to understand the impact that has on our community, not just in where we spend our money, but the impact on where we get our food, where we buy our clothes. You know what I'm saying? Like, all of those things have to be in consideration, because if it's not, then really it's a plan that, again, is going to starve itself out. Right, I can boycott Walmart for 3 days, but Lord knows when my 3-year-old needs some pull-ups, you understand what I'm saying? Right.
Something's got to give, and that is in essence the problem that a lot of us have. And I always try to think about. I mean, I think we need to boycott these companies, and boycotting means sacrifices, right? Shout out to Tabitha Brown, or maybe not shout out to her, but maybe acknowledging Tabitha Brown's request, which I thought was absurd, which is kind of like, let me take a step back. It's hard, right? Boycotts involve sacrifice. You may have to go a little bit further. You may have to catch a bus to get somewhere. You may have to pay $1 more. These are things that that are real, and I don't want to let people off the hook. At the same time, not all of us are equally positioned to make those sacrifices. I remember spending time in Palestine and at the height of BDS, the BDS discourse. And Palestinians were telling me, like, look, yeah, we're asking you to boycott this water. We're asking you to boycott this intel. We're asking you to boycott these things. But, like, yes, we need computers, and yes, we need water, and this is our only water. So no, we're not boycotting this water manufacturer, because without this manufacturer, we don't have access to water. But you as Americans do. And so you have to make different choices. And so we have to always be strategic, but also pragmatic about how we think about boycotts. And I think that's super important. Let me pivot. To something a little bit lighter.
One thing on this, Mark, just
well, please jump on in, Chris. I'm sorry, I didn't give you a chance to jump in.
Two quick things. The first one is that like boycotts en masse are difficult, but boycotts that are strategic. So like I think it's February 28th. It's like, on this one day, we can all collectively sacrifice on this one day just to show the ways that our money has impact. I think those are important. I also want to give a shout out to Julo.shop, JULO.shop, which is a Black-owned marketplace that has all Black products, Black-owned. They deliver quick, so everything from food to Pampers and the work. So they're also alternatives. And then my last point on this, which I think is really, really important, is like, we have to understand that this is where who we elect into office plays a significant role, right? And not for the rules that they put in play, or not for the the back and forth with the executive and legislative branch. For folks who are into civics, I really appreciate what they do and the sophistication around what happens in that arena. But who we elect is important, because the narratives they drive move people more than the decisions that they make. And when we were going back and forth about putting this clown in office, there's a lot of debacle about like, who stands for who, and the Democrats are playing games with people also, and all this kind of foolishness. But at the very least, what we had was a clear narrative that nodded to our humanity. And even if it wasn't making sort of big inroads in the larger infrastructure, there was a narrative sent across the country that said, we value these things, and then companies and people followed suit. Elected officials in many ways are much more about what narratives they support and how they create a groundswell of support within the populace, less about what they do. And I really believe that. And so, like, let's not abandon the fact that there's still elections. I mean, there's still representatives to vote for that support our narratives in spite of what's happening at the executive branch of the federal government. And then the last piece of this is for me, like, sometimes like you gotta how do I say this in a way that's not really harmful? Like, not everybody and not every company is invited to the cookout because they nod at you. And I think part of what's happening here is we've created a grand narrative where any signal that showcase that you might like Black people, or that you project 90 years from now, you're going to hire a possible one. We're like, we're rocking out. And so, like, we ride out with lanes too easy. You know what I mean? And it's like, even in this instance, there's a company that's going to take advantage of the fact that we are collectively frustrated. And they're going to be like, we're the ones out of the other white-owned companies that still like Black folks. And we're like, look at them. And we rush to them. And it's like, you can't first of all, you can't unlame lame structures or lame people.
Amen.
These folks already told you who they were. Then they played in your face and you started trying to unlame lames. And so you've got to kind of like keep your eyes open and understand the ways that we're being collectively manipulated. And then the last piece, and I promise it's the last piece. Also,
take your time, Pastor. We ain't got nowhere to go.
Oh, dope. This is also like a really convenient opportunity for folks to not follow through on what was a capital investment on Black humanity. They're like, woof, we got Trump here. We ain't got to pay for that, because though all those efforts required scouts to go in communities and find folks, it required training in schools to get folks to be able to fill these jobs. And so, we were really excited about the grand narrative about what they would do, but they were always looking for a convenient excuse not to invest capital in it. And so when you have the wrong person in office, it gives a convenient way to say, the reason why we're not doing this anymore is because the federal government is making these narratives. In reality, you were looking for a convenient excuse not to put that capital investment in the humanity of Black and brown folks.